Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Dear sir, we are truly honored to have you with us today. May Allah bless you for the rich experience that you are bringing to share with us, and may Allah increase the good work that you are doing to build bridges between Muslim youth and communities. There will be a question answer session to all the participants. At the end of the talk, kindly type in your questions so that we can give it to Brother Navaid Aziz. Without further ado, I invite Sheikh Navaid Aziz to give us the talk today. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين أما بعد. My dear brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Jazakumullah khairan for having me. SubhanAllah, I never thought a time would come where I would be doing a lecture for Muslim youth in the United Arab Emirates virtually online. Allahu Akbar, it's amazing how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala plans these things. For today's session, I wanted to share some reflections on life and faith. And these are just personal stories from my own life that we're going to bring some ayat and hadith to expand upon as well. So for those of you that don't know, I was actually born and raised in Montreal, Canada. Montreal is actually one of the few French cities in the country. So growing up over there, it was a very different experience for me because Muslims were not really known that well. No one knew who we were. There were very few colored people. So it was a very insular experience. Like trying to make friends was actually very, very difficult. And I remember when I was around 9 or 10 years old, we actually moved out of the city and moved to the suburbs. And the experience got even worse after that. Like I cannot remember seeing a person for color, until a very long time. Now, as I got into high school, something interesting happened. I went to a very large high school where there were about 2,000, youth or children that were going to this high school. And out of those 2,000 students, maybe about 50 colored people. Out of those 50 colored people, I would say that maybe there were about 20 Muslims. And for myself, I never interacted with other Muslims, prior to that. If there was any sort of conversation, it was more of a racial identity, being Indian, being Pakistani, and it was never really about being a Muslim. But in high school, there was an MSA, it was a Muslim Student Association that used to pray 5 times a day. And eventually what ended up happening was, I didn't fit in with the white kids in the school. And I naturally started sitting with all the colored kids in the school. And I found this brother who was always like, you got to come pray, you got to come pray. And in the back of my mind, I was like, that's something my dad does. Like, why do I have to do that? And this sheds some light in terms of what my upbringing was like at home. My father used to pray 5 times a day, mashallah, tabarakallah, but he would never actually tell us, let's go pray. It was something he did by himself. And then as for my mother, she taught us like the basics of the Quran. So while driving us to school, she would have some Quran playing, and maybe with some basic du'as, but that was pretty much about it. That's all I knew of my faith. And the turning point came when I actually got into high school and I met these group of Muslims from the Muslim Student Association. They introduced me to the concept of memorizing Quran and attending halaqas and, attending Jum'ahs and eventually giving Jum'ahs. And this is the first point I wanted to share, that, as a young individual, we think that we should become friends with people that we have commonalities with, people that watch the same shows as us, people that like the same sports as us, people that support the same sport teams as us. But eventually you realize that those are all trivial matters. You will eventually, change your loyalty for which sports teams you like. Eventually, as you grow older, you'll start to enjoy different sports. So those relationships will change. But those relationships that are based upon deen and based upon morals and ethics, those are the relationships that inshallah will last forever and will last for up until the hereafter, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. And this is a very interesting concept, but when you look inside Surah Al-Kahf, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he reminds the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam that be patient, wasbir nafsaka ma'a alladhina yad'una rabbahum, that be patient and stick with those people that continue to call upon their Lord day and night. And this would probably be the first piece of advice that I would give someone, is that if you're looking to hold on to your faith and if you're looking to practice your faith well, it's very important that you surround yourself with good people, people that have that commonality with you, that have that interest with you. Yes, from time to time, they might not be the coolest people, But at the end of the day, they are people that are going to be loyal. They are the people that are going to be there for you in your times of need. They are the people that are going to make dua for you. They are the people that will visit you when you're sick. They are the people that will pray your janazah, right? They are the people that, when tough times come, they are the ones that are going to drag you back to the masjid. So that's the first piece of advice that I would give, is always stick to those people that bring you closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, as I started to learn more and as I got older, I'm probably about 13, 14 years old right now. And my mother basically tells me during the summertime that you either get a job or you go to summer school. And those are your pretty much your two of your options. And my aunt and uncle at that time, they were on their way to Pakistan to attend a wedding. And I was like, look, how about I don't go to summer school, I don't go to work, but I'm going to Pakistan to attend this wedding, who I had no idea who they were. Like, they would have been like fifth or sixth cousins, like no close proximity whatsoever. And interestingly enough, they were stopping by Dubai during that time. So we ended up spending like 2 weeks in Dubai before we went to Pakistan. And that was perhaps one of the first real experiences that I had of Islamic education, where at the Sharjah Dawah Center, there was a very famous scholar to Islam, Sheikh Abu Amin Abdullah Phillips. And I attended like a 1 week program that he had going on over there. And, we had some question and answers, and it was very, very beneficial for me. And then the next summer, I did the exact same thing, and it was even more productive. So by 14, 15 years old, I've developed, a keen love for learning the deen. And I think the big turning point in my life was when I was 15. My father was going for Umrah. And I told my father, look, you have to take me with you. I want to go and experience Umrah. And to give you some background story behind this, the first time I went for Umrah, I was probably about 7 or 8 years old. And I had a terrible experience, a disaster of an experience. As a young child, I couldn't understand why we needed to wear ihram. Like, why was I not allowed to wear underwear underneath my ihram? And no matter what my parents did, I just couldn't understand it. And it turns out, subhanAllah, I got so sick on that trip. I was very, very sick on that trip. And I just had that negative experience. So now, as I got older, I'm 15 years old, I've started memorization of the Quran, I'm learning the deen. I was like, I have to give this another shot. I have to experience this again. And my father, he brings me to Umrah with him, Allahu Akbar. And we spent pretty much the whole month of Ramadan in Mecca and Medina. And it was a phenomenal experience. But what I remember the most were the last 10 nights that we spent in Mecca, because not only were we able to make i'tikaf for most of the time, but also that was the first time I met one of the major scholars of Islam, Sheikh Muhammad ibn Salih al-Uthaymeen, rahimahullah ta'ala. And that was an inspiration within of itself, to pray Salat al-Fajr in al-Masjid al-Haram. And then after Salat al-Fajr, you have literally, without exaggeration, between 5 to 7,000 people sitting around a sheikh, keenly learning and studying and trying to absorb everything that he has to say. And for me, I was like, man, subhanAllah, you can feel like the presence of the angels in that gathering. And that was another life-changing experience for me. And the point I want to extract from this is the role that family plays in the development of our religion. And for those parents that are listening, this is advice to you, for the young children, for the teenagers that are listening. Eventually, when you become parents, this is advice for you as well. But you have to develop some sort of religious relationship with your parents, because that was perhaps the fondest memory that I have with my father, rahimahullah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala have mercy upon him and grant him Jannah, that he took me for that Umrah trip. And that was a very, very special trip to me. And that again was a turning point in my life, because 4 years later, that is when I got accepted into the Islamic University of Medina and spent, the best years of my life studying there. And that was a catalyst for that. So now when it comes to faith and family, it's very important that young children see congruency of faith and family in their lives. They have to see their parents practicing. They have to see their parents being ethical and moral individuals. We can't see our parents saying one thing but doing something else. So our parents play a huge role in our lives in terms of our development of religion and our appreciation of the religion. And this is a more of a psychological point. And when you look at this point, there's a huge reason that the first point of contact that we have in our lives is our parents, because they are the ones that are meant to guide us and support us. Now, what do you do in a situation that, what if your parents aren't religious? What happens in that situation? And this is where I want to share another story with you. So, again, when I was about 14 years old, as I told you, my mother, she was a very cultural Muslim. She was a very cultural Muslim. And she actually invited a very, very famous singer from Pakistan. I always butcher his name, so please excuse me for that. But Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan, he actually came to our house, and my mother invited him for dinner, and he came with his entourage, and there was a whole bunch of people there. And when my mom told me that he was coming to our house, I basically rebelled. I said, no, this is not happening. We're not going to allow this to happen. And I was 14 years old, the youngest person in the house. No one would listen to me. And she basically tells me, look, you're too young to have an opinion. Your opinion is irrelevant. So what I decided to do that day was actually protest. I told her, look, if he's coming to our house, I'm going to go sleep in the masjid. And she thought I was joking at that time. But that night, after Salatul Isha, I didn't come back from the masjid, and I stayed there and I spent the night. So eventually, when the whole function was over at her house, it's like 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. She's panicking and worried. Where am I? Why haven't I come home? She doesn't know where I am, and she starts calling the masjid because that was the last place that I was. But the masjid, at the phone was broken, and even if it worked, no one was going to pick up the phone. And I just knocked out in the masjid. And interesting enough, remember I was telling you about friends? I got two of my friends, and that's what we did. We just stayed in the masjid the whole entire night. So after we prayed Salat al Fajr, I came back home, and my mother is crying and crying and crying. And obviously, I felt bad for making her cry, but in the, like deep down inside, I was like, maybe she'll learn her lesson this time. And Allahu Akbar, it was a phenomenal moment, because that was the first time where I spoke about Jannah and Jahannam with my mother. And I told her, look, there's certain actions that lead us to Jannah, and there's certain actions that lead us to Jahannam. And we need to be very, very careful at that time. And I think that was a turning point in my mother's life, where she started to take the deen more seriously. She, took the first steps to start praying again, and things of that nature. So that was like a big pivotal moment. And this teaches us that, subhanAllah, even the impact that youth can have on their parents. So that's just because your parents may not be the most practicing people, it doesn't mean you have to wage war with them. It doesn't mean you have to constantly argue and bicker with them. But in these sort of situations, you need to find the best way to speak about the deen without them being judged, without them being belittled. Because you have to understand, at the end of the day, they are still our parents. At the end of the day, they are the ones that brought us into this world and took care of us and supported us. So you have to make sure that you have that good relationship with them in your life. Now, the last point I'll speak about in terms of relationship with parents is, you never realize the barakah that they bring to your life up and until they're gone, subhanAllah. Like my father passing away, rahimahullah, I eventually moved away. I live in Calgary now. It's about a 4.5 hour flight to Montreal, where my parents used to live. And I was able to go back maybe once every 2, 3 months to see them, but we would speak on the phone every day. And when he passed away, rahimahullah, you can feel like certain elements of barakah in your life disappear. And the only conclusion you come to, it was from the dua of your parents. The only conclusion you can come to is that it was from the dua of your parents. And this is something that I can't emphasize enough, is that you want to stay in your parents' good books as much as possible, because their du'as are what are going to change your life. Like you passing exams, it's like 10% is of you studying and 90% is the dua of your parents. Like that's the way I view these matters. Like if you don't have the dua of your parents, you could work as hard as you possibly want and can, and it's not going to come to anything, because that element of barakah isn't there. That element of barakah isn't there. So cherish the presence of your parents as long as you can. Keep seeking their du'as, keep being good to them. I'll share one last point on the topic of parents before we move to the next subject. Um, one Abdullah ibn Abbas radiallahu anhuma, he saw a man crying one day, and he asked him, why are you crying? And he mentions that, my second parent just passed away. And Abdullah bin Abbas, he did the right thing. He tried to console him, tell him that don't worry, look, your parents are in a better place now. Allah will have mercy upon them and engulf them and enter them into Jannah. And this man, he tells Abdullah bin Abbas radiallahu anhum, I'm not crying because my parents died. I'm crying because my middle gate to Jannah closed. I'm crying because my middle gate to Jannah closed. And that's the way you want to view that relationship with your parents, is that they are your middle gate to Jannah. They are the ones that bring an immense amount of barakah to your life. And yes, while you're a teenager, you may want to rebel, you may want to do things very differently. You may think they're very cultural. You may think they don't understand. But eventually, as you grow older, you learn that those are all trivial matters. That enjoy that relationship, cherish that relationship, benefit from that relationship as much as you can. They have a lot of wisdom to share that we are not going to be able to experience. They have experienced a very different life than what generation X, Y, and Z and millennials and all of the as people are experiencing right now. They had some real struggles in trying to provide for their families. So benefit from that experience while you can. The next topic I wanted to touch on were the things that we expose ourselves to, the things that we expose ourselves to. So, growing up with my father, he loved to watch wrestling. He absolutely loved watching wrestling. So, I remember on Friday nights and Saturday nights on TV, they used to have that time it was called WWF, and we'd watch wrestling. And I grew up watching wrestling probably till about the age of 8 or 9 until we moved to the suburbs of Montreal, and then we didn't really watch it after that. But I grew up with this concept of watching TV with my family, and the good with that is that you spend time with your family. You're not out of the house. You're not doing crazy, silly things. But the bad of that is that you get exposed to things and you become normalized to things. Like men wearing their underwear and dancing around on TV became like a norm, and there was like this concept of desensitization, and eventually, they started bringing women into wrestling, and that was much later on. Alhamdulillah, by that time I had stopped. But the point I wanted to share with you is what you expose yourself to, what your eyes see, what your ears hear, what your mind thinks about, they impact your actions greatly. They impact your actions greatly. And we live in a day and age where you have easy access to whatever you want to watch. You want to watch Netflix, you just get onto your computer, onto your phone, you can watch it. Amazon Prime, whatever you want to watch, you have easy access to. And it's so easy to get consumed in this culture of binge watching. And that's the first thing I want to mention is the topic of wasting time, right? It's so easy to waste time in this day and age where you can go to social media. After you're done with social media, you watch something, you're done watching, you go back to social media, and it's this vicious cycle of wasting time. One of the famous tabi'een, one of the scholars from the second generation, Al-Hasan al-Basri, he mentioned something very profound. He says, إِنَّمَا أَنْتَ أَيَّامٌ فَإِذَا ذَهَبَ يَوْمٌ ذَهَبَ بَعْضُكَ. That indeed you're only a number of days. Our life is only a number of days. And if a day departs, understand that part of you has departed as well. So make your days count. Make your days count. And that's what I wanted to mention, that it's okay to use social media. It's okay to watch something halal. Always run that by your parents. Make sure that they agree with what you're watching, um, and that's fine. But don't be excessive in that. Don't be over consumed by that. Don't make that your main culture. You want to do that as a pastime and not your whole entire life. Like we live in such a crazy times where young people grow up and they're like, I want to be a social media influencer. That is the profession they want to have. I want to be a TikTok star. I want to be an Instagram model. And this was a thing that you would never expect from Muslims in particular, but it's getting in there. So what I would say is that don't get over consumed by this culture of social media and by watching and by pop culture, but understand that we're in this dunya as for a short period of time. That this is you're here for 60, 70 years. Your ultimate destination is Jannah, and that's what we're striving for. So you have to work towards it. So yes, from time to time you will need to pass time, use social media and the internet, but don't be over excessive, and don't make that your main thing. Don't make that your main thing. Get an education, work hard, strive hard, serve the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, support good causes. That's what we want to try to do. The second component of pop culture and social media are the things that we actually watch. That if you ask your parents, what watching TV was like in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and then ask them to watch something on TV now, like they will feel shocked and ashamed to watch the stuff that we get exposed to. They will feel shocked and ashamed to watch the stuff that we do. And this shows us that over time, people are losing their modesty. Over time, people are losing their modesty. So we live in a culture where there is this concept of hyper lewdness, where we want to just completely remove modesty altogether. And this is something that, as Muslims, we have to try to protect and conserve as much as possible, because the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he says that iman and modesty go hand in hand. Iman and modesty goes hand in hand. And when one leaves, the other does as well. The other does as well. So you have to be very careful of what your eyes get exposed to, what your ears listen to, because eventually they impact your thoughts, and eventually um, they impact your actions. Eventually, they impact your actions. So be very, very careful of that. And the more you're able to protect your eyes and your ears and your thoughts while you're young, the better it is for you as you grow older. The better it is for you as you grow older. And this is something that the Prophet ﷺ mentions, that one of the categories of people that will be protected on the day of judgment, the day that there is no shade other than the shade of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is shabun nasha'a fi ibadatillahi ta'ala, is a young person that's raised in the worshipping of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So you want to make sure that you are that individual that is raised worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that protects themselves, protects their modesty, that doesn't look at haram things, that doesn't listen to haram things, so you don't think haram things and you don't do haram things. That is the cycle that always happens. Now, the last part that I want to speak about is the importance of seeking knowledge, is the importance of seeking knowledge. So as I mentioned, when I was like 15, 16 years old, I joined this halaqah where we would play sports on Saturday morning. And then after we're done playing sports, we'd sit down and have something to eat and have a halaqah. It started off with, simple tafsir of Juz Amma, and then basic hadith from Imam Nawawi's 40 hadith. And eventually we got to like more advanced surahs and things like that. But for me, that is something that I still cherish till this day. In fact, if you look at my love for Juz Amma, it stemmed from that, because I have so many positive memories with those guys that I was hanging around with and playing sports with. We studied these surahs together. So as you grow older, you realize that knowledge is like the best currency in life. It's not about money, it's about information and knowledge. And the more knowledge you have, the better you worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but the better you understand the reality of this world. The better you understand the reality of this world, and you realize that it's not worth all the glamour and pompous that people make it seem. That people come and go, but it is their deeds that are going to benefit them in the hereafter. So I would suggest that take it upon yourself to learn as much of the deen as you can. For a lot of you, you may not be able to learn the Arabic language. You may not be able to go and live in Mecca and Medina to study the deen, but do whatever you possibly can. And this is the beauty of our times, is that because everything is so accessible technologically, there are some great resources that you can start off with. So the three, programs I always suggest are Yaqeen, Al-Maghrib, and Al-Qadam. Like these three institutes online do phenomenal work. They do absolutely amazing work. And Yaqeen basically focuses on apologetics. And what apologetics is, challenging questions that Muslims face. So how do we understand the topic of hudud? How do we understand certain allegations that are made against the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam? Yaqeen does a very good job of answering those questions. Then Al-Maghrib, they come in and they teach you the basics of Islam. They teach you everything that a Muslim is required to know, from the fiqh of tahara to the fiqh of salah, to basic hadith, to basic tafsir, and things of that nature. And then after you've done that, and you want to do something more progressive, where you develop your Islamic understanding, then that's where Qalam comes in really handy. They do more detailed tafsir, more detailed fiqh, more detailed hadith. And that is like a sort of guideline that I would suggest, that take advantage of those free resources. And you would notice that if you spend, literally without exaggeration, just an hour a day, just 1 hour a day out of the 24 hours that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given in your day, if you just spend 1 hour a day studying your deen, give yourself a year or two, and you will see that you would have made a lot of progress. You would have seen that you made a lot of progress. Related to this, if you're able to learn the Arabic language, that makes understanding the deen so much better. It actually helps you appreciate the deen a lot more as well, because you understand the nuances of the Quran. And also try to memorize as much of the Quran as you can. Try to memorize as much of the Quran as you can. Now, I'll leave you with my concluding remarks, and that is, the more you invest in yourself now, the more it pays off later. That is the reality of life. The seeds that you plant today are the fruits that you harvest tomorrow. That is the reality of life. So, as a young person, invest in your education. As a young person, invest in the relationship with your parents. As a young person, invest in your deen. As a young person, invest in your worshiping of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. As a young person, invest in your health, get active, do physical activity, become physically strong. Invest in all of these things so that later on in life you have this good foundation, you have the discipline, and you can be successful in life, in this life and the next. You can be successful in this life and the next. And that is what we're actually striving to do. So those are just some basic things I wanted to share with all of you, some insights that I've experienced in my own life. I pray it was beneficial. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant us all tawfiq and accept from us, protect us from all evil, and grant us all good in this life and the next. Allahumma ameen. Jazakumullah khairan. And I'll entertain your questions now, inshallah, if you guys have any.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa
Am I
alaikum
audible?
assalam. Yes, you are.
Yeah. Yes, we have some questions from the participants.
Sure.
One is about ladies aspiring to become wildlife photographers. So I think
Okay.
basically it's about the careers that ladies can or cannot aspire to.
Mm-hmm. So photography within Islam is actually permitted. You are allowed taking pictures. That is not a problem. But some caveats that come with taking pictures is, number one, you want to be taking pictures of something that is halal. You cannot take pictures of something that is haram. So if someone is dressed immodestly or dressed inappropriately, you shouldn't be taking pictures of those things. Wild animals are perfectly fine. You are allowed taking pictures of wild animals. And that is not an issue. A second issue, that when it comes to pictures, pictures should not be hung inside of the house. So they shouldn't be framed and displayed inside of the house. You can preserve them digitally, have them on a hard drive, have them on your computer, have them on your phone, have them on your tablets. That's perfectly fine. But they shouldn't be displayed on walls inside of the house. Those are the two major caveats when it comes to photography. And there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, one of the things I wish I had learned better was photography. I consider myself a professional of using portrait mode on the iPhone. That's as far as I got. And even that, subhanAllah, is amazing how in our day and age you have that portrait mode on the iPhone that makes you look like a professional photographer. So I think that's perfectly fine, and one can aspire to do that. Keep in mind, if this is a career you are pursuing, it is very, very difficult to make money from photography. Very, very difficult. Like, there are very few people, like literally less than the 1% of the elite in photography that get contracts from like National Geographic and from magazines and things like that. So do understand the challenge that you're getting into if you're making this a full-time profession. You can keep it as a hobby, keep it as a side business, but I don't know if I would necessarily recommend making it a full-time business unless you feel you have the ability and natural talent to become from the elite of the elite in this field. And Allah knows best.
Okay. There is another question about how to improve concentration in salah, in prayer.
Excellent. So in terms of approaching the salah, there's quite a few things that we can do. I'll give you a short answer, and then I can share some resources with you as well. So in terms of a short answer, having khushu and salah, having concentration in salah, actually starts before the salah. So when you're making wudu, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he reminds us that this wudu will be a shining light for you on the day of judgment, and that your sins are actually forgiven when you're making wudu. And it's very important to keep those things in mind. And as you approach the salah, you want to make sure that you rid yourself of all distractions. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam says that if food has been served, then eat before you pray. And that is because if you don't do that, you will be distracted. And this applies to all other elements of our life as well. That if you have to go to the bathroom, if you have to, respond to a very important email, if you have to, respond to a text message, do it before you actually get into the salah so that you're not distracted by it. And you have to understand that there is a special qareen, a special shaitan that uses those things to distract you in the salah. So if you don't take care of those things, you've basically just given leverage to that qareen, to that shaitan, to distract you in salah. Number three, that as you stand for prayer, the scholars of the past used to talk about visualization, and that visualization was different for every scholar. But in summary, they would imagine as if Jannah was in front of them and Jahannam was behind them, that the angels of death were present, ready to take your soul, that the angels of good deeds were watching you and writing down your good deeds. So that sort of visualization will have a huge impact on your salah and your khushu in the salah. And the last but not least is understanding what you're saying. Like the very simple statement of Allahu Akbar. Why did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala choose that statement to start off the salah instead of La ilaha illallah, or instead of Subhanallah, or instead of Alhamdulillah? We start off with Allahu Akbar as a reminder to ourselves that there is nothing greater in our lives right here, right now, than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There's no one more important in our lives right here, right now, than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Then as you start Surah Al-Fatiha, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam says that this is a conversation with Allah. That when you say Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, my Lord and my servant has praised me. My servant has praised me. So imagine that conversation with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Imagine what that's like. So that's a summarized version of understanding the statements and actions, visualization in the salah, taking away distractions and the spiritual elements of the salah, focusing on those. In terms of resources, there's actually a very good free program happening in Ramadan. 6 out of the 7 sessions have already been completed, but you can catch up on them. It's called The Sweetness of Salah by Dr. Farhan Abdul Aziz. You can check it out on Al Maghrib's Facebook page. The sessions are there. Also, Sheikh Mu'tasim Hamidi, he has a workshop on khushu and salah. I remember seeing that on YouTube. So if you type in Mu'tasim Hamidi khushu and salah, it's about a 2 to 4 hour workshop on khushu and salah. That's very good. There's a book that's been translated called The Spiritual Dimensions of Salah. This book is originally written by Ibn al-Qayyim and has been translated to English. It's about 60 pages or so that talks about the spiritual dimensions of Salah. So those are some good resources to refer to as well, inshallah.
Yes, there is a question on somebody has asked, like recently they heard that Allah will not forgive if we talk about our sins or if we expose our sins. Is there something like that?
Excellent. SubhanAllah, you know, a very interesting story that in this month of Ramadan, after we pray Salat al-Maghrib as a family, we read from Riyadh al-Salihin. We read from Riyadh al-Salihin. And last night's hadith was this very topic. Last night's hadith was this very topic that Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu, he narrated from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam that all of my ummah will be pardoned and forgiven except for al-mujahideen. And the Prophet ﷺ was asked, who are the mujahideen? And the Prophet ﷺ responded that they are the ones that commit a sin at night and Allah conceals their sin. Yet in the daytime they come and they say, last night I did such and such a sin. And removing the veil, that curtain that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had placed on their sin. They are the ones that will not be forgiven. So now what we understand from this hadith is that if one has committed a sin, the general rule and norm is that you don't expose that to anyone. You are never meant to expose that to anyone. You keep that to yourself. And this increases the modesty and shyness that we have as Muslims, that we shouldn't expose the sins that we do and continue to have that shyness and modesty. Now, are there any exceptions to this rule? And the answer to that is yes. There are 2 exceptions to this rule. Exception number 1 is if one is trying to seek help. So, for example, one has a severe addiction to something haram, then you are allowed talking about that addiction to a professional and seeking their help at that time. The second exception to this rule is if you're using a particular incident to benefit someone. So, for example, we see the scholars of the past that used to speak about on how they used to drink alcohol, and then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guided them and they were able to change their ways. So this shows us that they were using those stories as a form of inspiration for others, that if I was able to change, you too are also able to change with the help of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that is the general rule. And this is something I actually want to highlight. I think this is a great point. That again, when you tie this into social media, you know, we want to Snapchat everything. We want to TikTok everything. And we think, you know what, that is the cool thing to do. But in reality, there's certain things that you can put on social media, and there's certain things that you shouldn't be putting on social media. So if you're engaged in a haram activity, you don't want to be putting that up on social media. That is part of al-mujahara, which is showing off the sins that you commit. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala concealed that sin for you. We have no right to expose that to the people. And that is something that we should abstain from. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best.
Yes, there is a question here. One of my relative son, who is 17 years old, has started acting in a way that indicates that he is moving away from deen and related matters. He is suffering from anxiety issues as well. The family is a practicing family and they have always tried to instill Islamic values in the children. But he is questioning the very basic values and pillars of Islam and says that it is his right to ask. The family is in shock and they have no idea how to deal with their son.
Hmm. Excellent question. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make things easy for them. So, a couple of points that I would mention over here. Number one is the congruency of the parents, as I was mentioning, that it's very important. Please excuse me. It's very important that the parents practice what they preach. That if they want the children to be good, they have to be leading good ethical lives themselves. Number two is, are they continuously making dua for their children and the guidance of their children? Number three is investing in their Islamic education. You have to invest in their Islamic education from when they are young, because as they get older and they get exposed to different things, it's very difficult to develop a foundation at that time when they're already exposed to other philosophies and ideologies. Whereas if you've done that from when they're young, they already have that strong foundation. And then the last point is in terms of the friends that they're hanging out with and what they get exposed to. Now, that is a preventive measure. What do you actually do in this situation here, where this young teenager is already questioning his faith, and how do you handle that? Number one is the importance of keeping open dialogue. You can never tell your child, don't ask this question. You shouldn't be asking that question. The more you tell them that, the more they're going to wonder, why are you trying to hide things from me? I can go somewhere else and learn it, and that's something that you don't want to happen. Number two, even in this state, keep making a dua for them. Number three is that you have to win people's hearts before you win their minds. That it is natural to get into arguments. It is natural to get into debates. We're not going to understand the process that people go through when they have a crisis of faith. So it's very easy to become judgmental, but that's something you want to abstain from. You want to be as supportive as possible in their journey and trying to navigate out their faith. Number four, I would refer to Yaqeen Institute as a great resource. So any questions that they raise for you, be honest with them. Tell them, look, I don't know the answer, but let us research this topic together. Go to Yaqeen, try to look up whatever the topic is. If you don't find it there, reach out to their team. They actually have a great support team to help you answer questions. But even greater than that is they've actually created curriculums and programs for teenagers that have questions about their faith. So you can go through their curriculums and their resources, and you'll find great material over there. The last point that I would mention is that anytime you have a visiting scholar, try to introduce your child to them and let them have some one-on-one time with them where they can ask their questions and engage with them, and that'll be a positive experience that will hopefully change. The last point I'll mention in this is, let's just say you've done all of those things. You've done your utmost best, and you've tried your utmost best, yet your child just still doesn't listen. What happens in that situation? What happens in that situation is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has already given us a precedent, and that is in Nuh alayhi salam, who is not only a prophet of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he's from the ulul azam, from the most revered of prophets, where Nuh alayhi salam, his own son, disbelieved. Nuh alayhi salam is a nabi of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and his own son disbelieved. And this is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he tells us in the Quran, وَجَعَلْنَا بَعْضُكُمْ لِبَعْضٍ فِتْنَةً أَتَصْبِرُونَ, that we've created some of you a trial for one another. Will you be patient? And this is how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tests certain people. So if that happens, understand that this is a test from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that you have to be patient upon. Now, what happens to parents at that time is they start thinking, oh, what will happen to my reputation? What will people say? My dear brother, my dear sister, that is completely irrelevant. Be more concerned about your child than your reputation. That is the most valuable advice that I can give you on that matter. And just be patient. Eventually, if you've given them a good foundation, be optimistic that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will return them to that foundation. You look at the story of Yaqub alayhi salam. Yaqub alayhi salam has 12 young men as children. He has these 12 males. Two of them grow up righteous. The third of them eventually becomes righteous in the story, but the rest of the remaining 9 kids, it took them a very long time to learn their righteousness. It took them a very long time to learn their righteousness, and they too eventually became prophets of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So as at a young age, they might astray a little bit, but focus on the larger picture, that if you establish a good foundation, be positive and optimistic that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will return them back to the straight path as you continue to make dua for them and work with them in their challenges and hardships.
We have 2 more questions. Youths these days aspire to become a soccer player or think of being a professional sports player when they grow up. What are
Right.
the challenges from an Islamic perspective in such careers? And can we play games of dice like Ludo, Snake and Ladders, etc.?
Sure. So I'll answer the dice question first, then we can talk about becoming a professional athlete. So the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he mentions an Arabic word called nard, and the Prophet sallallahu said that whoever plays with nard, it's as if they've dipped their hands in swine. And scholars differed over the interpretation of this hadith and what it actually means. And in summary, Nard was a game that was played during the Jahili times where people used to gamble away. And we're not just talking about money, they would gamble their lives away, they'd gamble their freedom away. And that is what became prohibited and forbidden. So the general rule on playing games with dice is that if there is something beneficial, like you're learning something, then it's definitely fine. If there isn't something beneficial, but at least you're having fun without any haram taking place in it, then it is something which is mubah. It is permissible to do so as long as it's not done excessively. So, like, there's certain games that I would play growing up, like Monopoly and Risk. Monopoly you finish in like 2 3 hours. Risk, could take like 10, 12 hours sometimes. A very, very long game, and you don't want to be involved in something like that. Like, it's fine, spend an hour, maybe two maximum with your friends doing something like that, but playing games all night, that's something that you want to stay away from. And obviously, as soon as gambling becomes involved, then it's completely haram. And that is something that you should abstain from altogether. Now, in terms of becoming a professional athlete, the similar advice that I gave to becoming a professional photographer, it applies. That you have to be the elite of the elite in order to become a professional athlete, and the vast majority of people are not going to reach that level. The vast majority of people are not going to reach that level. So something like sports, yes, it's great to be involved in sports. It's great to be involved in athletics, but use it as a part-time, use it as a part-time, unless again you have that natural talent. And if you feel that you have that natural talent and you are able to excel and you are naturally excelling, then yes, maybe that's something to invest in. But also keep in mind that getting involved in professional athletics, it comes with a very, very haram culture. That if you look at the vast majority of athletes and how they spend their time and their money, it's spent in clubs, it's drinking, there's womanizing involved, and there's a lot of haram involved, the drugs and everything, and the money that they have, they're not spending it in good causes for the vast majority of them. Yes, there are exceptions to the rules, but the vast majority of them, they're just buying more houses and more cars and more watches and things to show off with. So you have to understand that there's that culture of haram that comes with it, and there's very few people that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has saved in the professional athlete world from those fitan. So I do not believe that a Muslim should aspire to get involved in that unless, again, number one, they have that good foundation in their faith, where inshallah they will be protected if they become successful in it. And then number two, it is a natural talent that Allah has given them and they're naturally excelling at it from a young age, then invest time in it. If those two criterion are not met, then continue to use sports as a part-time and as a hobby, and not as a profession. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best.
Yes. Do we have time for any more questions? I think
Do you have?
one of the participants asked about praying Juma in the house because everybody is in the lockdown situation.
Right. So I'll answer this in two ways. For those individuals that live in Muslim countries, obey the law of the country. Whatever the law of the country says, obey the law of the country. For those that live in non-Muslim countries, I believe there's a lot more flexibility in that matter. And my personal view, this is not the opinion of any major scholarly body or any fatwa council, but this is just something from what I've studied and what I've discussed with my colleagues. I believe, considering the circumstances where we don't know how long it's going to be until Jummah is reestablished, then it is permissible to establish Jummah at home, but with conditions. Number one is that you meet the criterion of Jummah, which is having at least three adult men. So three men that are past the age of puberty. And number two, those that are qualified to lead the salah and to give the Jummah khutbah. And as long as those criterion are met, I believe it is permissible to have Jummah in the house. But if that criterion of three men is not met, then you pray Dhuhr, and inshallah you will get the reward of Jummah because you are not able to do so. But one thing I would like to highlight is just because we're not able to go to Jummah, it doesn't mean that we don't spend time weekly listening to a reminder, and that's something I can't emphasize enough. Um, that you have to spend time rejuvenating your iman. And for a lot of people, that is what used to happen on Jummah, where you get to hear a khutbah, you get inspired by it, and that keeps you going for the week until the next Jummah. So now in this day and age, if you're not able to pray Jummah and you're prevented from doing so, at least make sure you're listening to motivational, inspirational talks, and that'll get you through the week, inshallah. Allah knows best.
Sheikh, a last question to you. Can you just give us some important, pointers on emotional intelligence?
That's a workshop on itself. I think it's going to be very, very hard to give some pointers on that. But what I will say is that we have to understand what emotional intelligence means in the first place before we talk about it. Emotional intelligence is the ability to recognize your emotional state as well as the emotional state of the people that you're interacting with, and using that knowledge to achieve a common goal in that relationship. So I'll give a very quick example of this. If you look at the example of Fatima radiallahu anha, the daughter of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Let's jump ahead to the future in her life, where the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he whispered in her ear and she cried. He whispered in her ear again and she laughed. And Aisha radiallahu anha, she asked her, what happened at that time? And she said that when the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam whispered in my ear the first time, he told me that he was going to die, he was going to pass away. So I started to cry. And when he whispered in my ear the second time, he told me that I would be the first of his family members to join him in the hereafter. And I always think about this point, subhanAllah, you're a young person, and you've just been told that you're going to be dying very, very soon. Like, how would you take that information? How would you take that knowledge? And it would be something difficult to handle. People are told in this day and age that you're going to be dying within the next couple of months. People panic and frantic, and they have a crisis at that time. At Fatima radiallahu anha, she laughed. She laughed at the fact that she was going to be united with her father. So we see that the father had invested in the relationship with his daughter, so much so that when she found out that he was going to die, she cried. When she found out that she was going to be the first of his family members to join him, she laughed out of joy. She laughed out of joy. Now, how do you go about developing that? Like we learn about Fatima radiallahu anha being this confident woman, being this knowledgeable woman. How did that happen? How did this relationship develop? And we see very, very small things, like the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Every time Fatima radiallahu anha walked into the room, he would stand up for her and give her her seat, give her his seat wherever he was sitting, and that he would kiss her on the forehead and give her a hug every time she walked into the room. So without fail, this is something that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam did. When Fatima radiallahu anha eventually had kids, Hassan and Hussein radiallahu anhuma, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam took them to the masjid and took care of them. So he was very, very invested in her life. So this shows us that some basic points of emotional intelligence is understand the nature of the relationship, understand the emotions that are involved in the individuals, understand what level and what goal you're trying to reach in that relationship, and then also look at what are the things that you can do. Sorry? Is someone speaking?
No, it's not.
Okay. So you look at those things, and then that is how you use emotional intelligence to get to that goal. Now, there's a great book by Sheikh Michael Smith called With the Heart in Mind, Emotional Intelligence of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. It's published by Qalam Institute. So you can refer to that book as well. And also I did a 4-part series explaining that book on YouTube. So you can listen to that as well to get the explanation of that material. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best.
I think we have come to the end of our session. There are many questions. I hope we can put it forward to you later at a later time and get the answers so that we can communicate with the participants. And you have given us a very wonderful session. You have spoken about how parents are a barakah and a blessing to the children, and about the culture of social media, and also about the content and amount of time we have to spend on social media. You have also mentioned about the importance of seeking knowledge, And thank you very much, Sheikh. I would like to invite one of our participants to express the vote of thanks.
Thank you, sir, for that wonderful session and heart-rendering talk. I'm sure it has energized us to reflect more on our faith. I would like to thank UAE Islahi Center for organizing this session, and I extend my thanks to all the participants who have taken the time to attend today's session. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
عليكم